All right. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the Peace with Dementia Rosary Podcast. I'm joined with two champions of the dying and the disabled. Matt Dineen in Canada. He is a theology teacher up there and is a care partner for his wife, Lisa, who has frontal temporal dementia. We're also joined by Alex Schedenberg. He's the executive director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and he really is on the front lines of this issue of end-of-life care and dignity in life. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
With you, Matt.
So this is the first time we've had this is the first controversial topic I think we've had on the podcast. We talk about engaging loved ones with dementia. We've talked about the perspective of care partners when Matt came on, and we talk about making life better, but we've not really, and we've talked about death before, a beautiful death. What does that look like? But we've not talked about this important issue. And while also no clients have approached me and said, Matt, I'm interested in dying in this way, I think it's important to be proactive and preemptive in this issue and get education out there. And that's why I'm so glad to have both of y'all here to talk about this topic. Now, this topic came up about 2 weeks ago. Matt Dineen emailed me about a bill called C7 up in Canada, where both of them are, and this is medical aid in dying. So that's sort of the backdrop. I'll ask. Well, the episode's not about C7. It is important for us to know what's going on up north and also what's going on in several states here in the U.S. So with that, Alex, tell us about C7. What should we know about it? Why is it important to us in the United States and worldwide?
Okay, so the issue of Bill C7 is the changes that it's doing to our euthanasia laws. So euthanasia, or MAID as they call it in Canada, medical aid in dying, which is a euphemism to make you feel better about it, was legalized in June of 2016. So in less than a little over 3 years after that, so in September, October 2019, a Quebec court, this was a lower court decision. It was a superior court, but that's a lower court decision. Decided to strike down the requirement in Canada's law that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. That was always a problem anyway, to tell you the truth, because they never defined the term natural death as reasonably foreseeable. And if you understand the reality, all of our natural deaths are sort of reasonably foreseeable. But I mean, it was being interpreted very widely. Nonetheless, the court struck that down, which meant that someone who was not terminally ill could die by lethal injection, euthanasia. So let's first make a distinction here. Canada legalized both euthanasia and assisted suicide, but nearly all of those deaths are euthanasia. Euthanasia is when a physician or a nurse, etc., would lethally inject me. Now, it could be done in many ways. I say lethally inject because that's the most common way of doing it. Obviously, euthanasia is defined as someone has requested it and another person then does the act. So it's a form of homicide. And in fact, in Canada's criminal code, it's defined as an exception to homicide in the criminal code. And so they allow then this lethal injection to occur based on certain parameters. That one of the parameters was that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable, which was interpreted as terminally ill, but it didn't really mean that. But by doing that, then opened up the question, well, who can then die by euthanasia, assisted suicide in Canada? And so the government then brought forward this Bill C7, which was introduced in February of last year. Now, it's been delayed because of COVID. It's been delayed because of other reasons. But nonetheless, in that bill, they said that they would do a couple things. One of the things is that if you weren't terminally ill, so if your natural death was not reasonably foreseeable, you could die by lethal injection, but you'd have to have a 90-day waiting period. So that was the first thing. And they said, but if you are seen as dying, there would be no waiting period. So currently the law has a 10-day waiting period. They would eliminate that waiting period. Now, these are just minor things in a sense. But the other thing they did, which was concerning, is they said if somebody was already approved for MAID, euthanasia, lethal injection, that if they became incompetent before actually dying by euthanasia, if they had already been approved, they could still then die by euthanasia. So what that would mean is, let's say I was approved for euthanasia, and then within the 10 days, I had some massive stroke or coronary at some point. I have not died, I'm still alive, but I'm not capable now of consenting. They would accept my previous consent as a consent. So they were actually removing the other requirement in the law, which was the having to be able to consent at the time of death. And that's a concern, because now you're opening the door to people who can't consent. So as much as this was a bad bill, and there's other things to the bill too, but I'm not going to get into everything, it was passed in the House of Commons, and then it went on to the Senate. Now, Canada's Senate is appointed. They're not elected. So that's a big difference between Canada and the US. We have like the British system of appointing a Senate. The Senate, therefore, amended the bill, and they amended the bill to include people with mental illness alone. And they also amended the bill to include people who put it in their power of attorney or their advanced directive. So let's say when you're 28 years old and you're writing an advanced directive for yourself, you write down, if I, become incapable of recognizing my husband or whatever it is, right? Doesn't matter. I would want, if I become incompetent, I would want euthanasia. Then at the time of being incompetent, if you have not died yet by euthanasia, they could then schedule your euthanasia because you had requested it in your legal advance directive. So that's the two main differences that the Senate amended to the law. And now it's gone back to Parliament, right? Because Parliament had approved the previous bill. So then the Parliament now is debating the amendments. Now the government says it's going to accept the amendment that euthanasia for mental illness, but it won't accept the amendment for euthanasia based in having that through your advance directive. But they're planning to debate that question next. So they made it very clear, we're not accepting that at this time, but we will be debating that within the upcoming review of our euthanasia law. And I'll give you a little bit more information, which is probably not that important to your listeners, but it is important to Canadians. The original euthanasia law in Canada had what you called it had a 5-year clause in it that the law had to be studied beginning in June of 2020. The government has not done that study. So it's a pretty ridiculous situation, whether you oppose or support euthanasia, that you have a government that wants to amend its law before it's even bothered to do the required study that was legislated in the original law. That to me sounds a bit out there. That sounds like something that would only happen in certain countries that are less democratic than Canada would claim to be. Nonetheless, that is what's going on, and that is the reality. So they're planning then, after they pass this Bill C7, if they pass it, they're planning then to do research on this whole issue of advance directive. So the issue is not off the table. It's just off the table for today. Oh, I didn't get into assisted suicide. So euthanasia is done by lethal injection. Assisted suicide, they use the same drugs, but they give you those drugs and you technically have to take it yourself. That's what makes it an assisted suicide rather than a euthanasia, which would be usually done by lethal injection, which is, of course, a homicide. And then, as I say, they created an exceptional homicide in Canada. Now, to make things even more clear, in the Netherlands and Belgium, they do allow euthanasia for people with dementia, and they do allow euthanasia for people with mental illness alone. Now, what's the difference there than here is in the issue of mental illness alone, they have I would say it's not written in the law, but they have a protocol which says that it can't be done within a year. You must be at least a 1-year waiting period. And that if you're asking for euthanasia for mental illness alone, you must try all treatments within that year that are available, that are considered effective, before you can be approved for lethal injection. Whereas in Canada, you can reject all treatments and you can die in 90 days. And that's one of the big differences between the Netherlands, Belgium, and Canada's look at the law. That in Canada, they say you don't have to try any of the treatments. If they approve you, and then you would have to wait 90 days because you're not terminally ill, but it'd be a 90-day waiting period.
Okay.
And I think too, it's important, just to follow up on what Alex said, that Bill C7, which was based on the Quebec bill, which itself was predicated on the laws in Belgium. So, prior to, as Alex mentioned, up to 2015, prior to 2015, right, this was euthanasia and assisted suicide in our country was prosecuted under our laws. And now we've become, in a span of 6 years, the most liberal country in the world with euthanasia and assisted suicide laws.
Wow, very sad.
With the exception of child euthanasia. That's the only exception. In any other way, you're absolutely right. We are if Bill C-7 passes like it is right now, we would become the most quote permissive society for killing people. Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Matt, so tell me how you've been active, and how has the church responded to this? How have the bishops in Canada, have they spoken out about it? Have they taken action?
They did, because when I got involved, and again, I come at this, well, it's funny because as you mentioned at the outset of your show, I've been a theology teacher for nearly 25 years, and we're very fortunate in this country to have an expert, Canada's foremost expert like Alex, and the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. And I can remember when I started out teaching that I would teach my grade 7 and 8 students about this very issue. And I can remember telling them that in the Netherlands, there was boats that would take people out, go across the boundaries into the waters, okay, non-boundary waters, and there they would be euthanized, and then the boat would return back. And slowly, watching in your country, Oregon, and then slowly but surely watching this issue creep into our very own country.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you know, Matt, in 2013, my wife Lisa was diagnosed, and it has always been on my radar, because as you say in this area, it's always a slippery slope. And so the red flag has been there, because I've seen it. Alex, again, their organization sends out very key information, statistics from other countries, and you could see this creep in, and it's here. And so back when I got involved in 2013 with advocacy and calling for a national dementia strategy, I wrote every single Catholic bishop in this country. Unfortunately, I heard back from 3 of them, and they told me, and rightfully so, that at that time that they were focusing on, this would have been then a year later, about 2014, that they were focusing on the issue of euthanasia and getting the people of Canada, not just Catholics, but people, all Canadians, to really understand this issue. And so they said, we're sorry, in so many words, we're sorry, but right now that's not the foremost issue. And I said to them, it is, because you wait and see, the dementia will be one day included in the euthanasia assisted suicide laws. And sure enough, here we are. It's just, as Alex said, it's a matter of time. He mentioned about advanced directives, and it really scared me. And when I reached out to you about a week and a half ago, when our Senate put it back, with looking at the amendment to include people with dementia in advanced directives, I thought, geez, does getting, if somebody's worried about getting dementia at 28, what does that say about those who currently have dementia? And I think that's really, it's a sad state, but just because a person has dementia does not make them any less of a person.
As Matt would acknowledge, the language of Bill C-7 has really upset the disability community in Canada, and there was 2 reasons for that. First, they really jumped on board because of the Quebec court decision, the Truchon court decision, and the language used in that court decision, because the 2 plaintiffs in that court decision were both people with disabilities, and they challenged the euthanasia law based on the fact that they weren't terminally ill, they were not dying, their natural deaths were not seen as reasonably foreseeable, but they both had disabilities which were substantial, and therefore they said this was a discrimination. They were discriminated against because they could not have death by lethal injection because they were people with disabilities and not terminally ill. And the Quebec court agreed, but not only in that, the language of the decision was very much oriented towards the concept of that certain conditions, death is preferable than living with certain conditions. And so the second thing is, when you read Bill C-7, it really is then oriented towards people with disabilities. One of the reasons is it's based on this court decision, but even then, C-7 goes far beyond the court decision. The court decision said that your natural death being reasonably foreseeable would be struck from the law, meaning that you wouldn't have to be terminally ill. But this went far beyond that and opened the door, as I say, to people who became incompetent too, etc. And there was more to it, but I don't think it's worth discussing everything with it. But the greater issue to me is is Canada is moved so fast on this so quickly, and people talk about, oh, well, there's not really a slippery slope, etc. And I would say, well, I would think actually how they wrote the law originally was a type of a slippery slope, because they wrote the law, as I already mentioned, without effective definition. Like they used language like your natural death must be reasonably foreseeable, which really was never defined. What does that actually mean? They said you have to have physical or psychological suffering. What does it mean to have psychological suffering? How is that actually defined? Well, it was hard to define these things, and they did that on purpose, I believe, to actually lead to where we're getting to today, where they wanted there to be a natural growth of the law without them politically having to take the, how would you say, the attack from the people like ourselves for expanding the law so quickly. But this should be a concern to the U.S. in such a way, because we're just north of you. We're the same people. We have the same television shows, the same media, the same news. We're affected by the same culture. Mm-hmm. And yet Canada is buying hook, line, and sinker into the concept of it's a good idea to kill people with certain medical conditions. And we'll even go further than that. You don't really even need to have a medical condition. Having certain mental conditions, etc., death is preferable to life. And that's exactly what's going on. I'm not being extreme when I say it that way, because how the law is defined, how the law is set up. The law is set up that the physician or the nurse practitioner, because that's how it is in Canada, physicians or nurse practitioners, can make this decision based on their assessment of whether or not they agree your life's not worth living. The law requires me to make a request. That's correct. But I'm not actually the decision maker. The decision maker is that doctor or nurse practitioner. And that is very concerning. And then the act is done by actually lethally injecting you, which is, as I say, they say it's all about my choice, my autonomy, my freedom. When does it become my choice, my autonomy, my freedom, and somebody else is putting lethal drugs in my bloodstream?
Tell me more about that. What is the other side saying why they deserve this quote unquote right to die? Where does that come from?
Well, they're afraid of suffering, and they believe that that they have a right to end their life or have their life ended. Now, the problem with this concept is they sell it to the culture based on suicide. They say, and that's how actually the Supreme Court of Canada originally struck down the original law in 2015. They said that the law doesn't disallow suicide. So therefore, if the law doesn't disallow suicide, then there shouldn't be a problem with assisting a suicide. Well, the law never, they changed the law in the 1969. It was when it was changed on the suicide law was changed. It wasn't changed because the law was saying suicide is okay and we're promoting suicide. In fact, we've always had suicide prevention programs. What it was saying is people who attempt suicide usually have either a mental illness or other egregious factors. Locking somebody up in jail who failed at suicide is not exactly the way you deal with suicide. You deal with suicide by providing care for them. But now it gets flipped around where someone who has suicidal ideation, whether it be because of physical illness or whether it be because of mental illness or whether it be whatever it might be, suddenly that's seen as a possibility of, well, maybe now you shouldn't die that way, but we can kill you by lethal injection. It all becomes mixed up when you flip everything upside down, which is what they've actually done. But they talk about freedom, autonomy, and choice. But as I say, it's all a lie. It's not about freedom, autonomy, and choice. If you actually read the law, and you don't have to just read Canada's law, you can go to the Oregon State Assisted Suicide Law and read how it's written. It's actually giving the power into the hands of the physician, or in this case, Canada, also nurse practitioners, to be involved with causing your death. That's what it's doing. It's giving them the power to cause my death. That's how it's written. So you're putting a lot of power over life and death into a group of people's hands, so to say, and that would never be considered acceptable in any other circumstance except for, quote, quote, somebody is suffering. How do you define suffering? I don't know. I can't really define suffering. But anyway, Matt might want to comment on that.
I think too,
please.
Alex, an important point is that these are the same, the doctors and the nurse practitioners. My understanding is they're also the ones that sign off on the chart, which is frightening.
Yeah, so the law is designed, whether it be Canada, Oregon, or the Netherlands, that the doctor who decides to cause the death, that it's okay to do so, is the same doctor who can do the act, is the same doctor who then sends in the report. And so then they say, oh, well, we don't have really effective evidence showing abuse of the law. Well, when you design a law that is a self-reporting system, and that's the same in Oregon and Washington State where they have assisted suicide, and California too. What you have is a situation where the law is designed to protect the people who are involved in the act. And so therefore, it becomes very difficult to find abuse when the person doing the act is the only one who is the witness. Anybody else who might have witnessed the act is dead. You know, it makes it very difficult.
Matt, can you talk about suffering and so someone might say, yes, I'm suffering and I want to die. What do you say to them as far as how do you view suffering? What can we do for people who are in that position?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it goes right to the heart of the other side of this issue. And that is the need for greater palliative care in this country and in your country as well. I saw firsthand, my mom, God rest her soul, passed away 4 years ago. And for about the last 2.5, 3 months, she was in palliative care here in Ottawa after Elizabeth Bruyere Center. And I saw firsthand the people journey with her and walk with her and provide comfort and provide care. And I know as Catholics, we say that's what we're about. But we know that there's effective pain medication for, I believe it's 98% of illnesses. And they really were, myself and my family called those nurses and staff at Bruyere angels, because it was to see them. You know, my mom was suffering. She had many different illnesses, but she was content. And that is what we can provide to people who are at the end of life, and just journey, just be present, take care of them, you know, spend time with them, hold their hands. I remember pushing my mom in the wheelchair and just having some great talks with her. That's what we're called to do, is accompany, to be in the present with them. And I think that's something that we need to start reminding Catholics about, especially those who may not be familiar with this issue, that we have a duty to respond to those needs. The need for greater palliative care. I can think of a great senator we had in this country, Sharon Carstairs, who for years advocated for greater palliative care. And it just seems, and Alex would be able to speak on this, but it seems that report after report gets tabled, but yet there's very little money put in by the government, right? Where, as we've just heard in the last 5-6 years in this country, the focus has been on assisted suicide and euthanasia and not palliative care, and that needs to change.
Matt, you're very fortunate that your mother was able to be at Bruyere, because it's a world-class institute.
It is,
and there isn't that many Bruyere, palliative care institutions in Canada. There's some, but there's very few like Bruyere. So we're very fortunate. I'd go one step further and talk about jumping from where you're saying, and that's the whole thing that's fueling this whole euthanasia debate, and that is the whole issue of what does it mean to be human? Because there's a lot of loneliness today in our culture. We have a lot of people who die alone. We have a lot of people who are going through very difficult physical, psychological circumstances, emotional circumstances, who are going through, I would say, that dark time of their life, and who are alone. And this has become, and it's even more exacerbated by the fact that we have this COVID crisis, because now we're told we can't even visit people. So can you imagine a lot of the people in the last year who have died natural deaths? I'm not going to get into the issue of euthanasia. We're just talking about dying a natural death, and they were alone. This is a very not a human way to be, and yet this is what's going on. So what's really, as I say, one of the things that really drives this issue is this whole thing of loneliness and fear. We're normal human beings, and as normal human beings, we do fear having possible bad deaths. We do fear what the future might bring to us, and being alone always makes that worse. And we have more loneliness now than ever before, and in our culture. And I'm very concerned about that. Being with is truly an answer for making a difference in the culture, without a question. Without a question.
And to that point, Alex, in my work with advocating for dementia and creating places of worship that are dementia friendly and inclusive. I was speaking about 3 weeks ago to a colleague over in Scotland, and she was reminding me how people there have been that in the UK, that they've created a ministry for social isolation, that it's that serious. And I was just telling my students this today, and I was saying, it's not the old people, it's not just the elderly. We can be at home here and have people and still be lonely and isolated. And so they were quite surprised to hear that, but that's the extent. It is becoming an epidemic, this social isolation. And I can speak firsthand to it with my wife in a long-term care home for about 8 years. And the effects of COVID, I've seen the people who have passed away. I've seen every resident on her unit go downhill because of the lack of social contact.
That's exactly it. Because they have dementia or they have whatever condition, they're a human being and they need contact. They need other human beings. As I say to people, whether you believe in God or not, it's not the issue. That's just how we are as humans. That's how we tick. That's what makes us human. And we need that interaction, and it's a problem. But now we're going to get back to something which is important. Why is this also concerning Americans? Because you're saying, well, we have assisted suicide in a bunch of states in the US, but we don't have euthanasia yet. But remember, it's the same issue. It's the same issue. You have assisted suicide legal now in California. It's not only Oregon and Washington State, a few small states, in Vermont, tiny states. It's in California. It's in New Jersey. It's in some major places in the US now. And so it's really been growing in the US. Now, it doesn't mean it's a lot of people say, oh, it's becoming like, they say it's like a tidal wave in the US, but it's not, because in fact, every year in the US, like last year alone, they had 20 assisted suicide bills in the US, and all 20 were defeated last year. In 2017, there's 26 assisted suicide bills in the US, and all were defeated. So, obviously speaking, it's not a tidal wave, but the assisted suicide lobby keeps coming, and they just keep coming every year. Like this year alone, I think we're up to 17 or 18 bills right now in the US. And I hope none of them pass, but obviously you can see the pressure coming on us that every so many years are gaining another state that passes this. And why should you be concerned? Because it's exactly the same issue, assisted suicide and euthanasia. It's just being done a little differently. It's just a little different. It's the same drugs, it's the same problem, it's the same concept, it's the same reasoning. People are saying they want their life ended. Why are they saying they want their life ended, or they want to have their, lethal drugs to have their life ended? Because they're in fear. They're in, and I would say, yes, there are some of these radical autonomists out there. There's a few people out there that have this, I'm totally for autonomy. I want to do what I want with my life. And yeah, but assisted suicide and euthanasia don't fit that model, because in fact, somebody else is directly involved in the act, right? So it's not the same thing. Nonetheless, there are some people like that, but for most of it, it's because they're a human being. They're human, and they're going through fear, and they're going through a difficult time. And so I always say to people, why is this a concern? Because it's a natural growth. They say, oh, there's no such thing as a slippery slope. People in universities who study philosophy, they wear their white jacket or their suit tie, and they say, or sometimes they just have their long ponytail, and they say, oh, there's no such thing as a slippery slope. No, it's a natural extension. If you're going to allow killing, there's only one clear line. The clear line is either I can kill you or I can't kill you. That's the clear line. Once you cross the clear line, what are we doing then? We're debating the reasons why I can either kill you or not kill you. This is all we're debating after that. Because once you say it's okay to kill, then we're just debating the reasons. And so then it starts becoming like the Quebec court. It becomes discrimination. So they say, oh, you have to be terminally ill. Well, then what about the person who is not terminally ill? Well, someone makes a good court case and they bring it to a judge who's willing to hear that court case, and a judge who's open to the concept. They say, you're right, that is discrimination. So-and-so can have it and you can't have it. That's discrimination, you're right. And this is what you get. And it's a normal growth. So right now in the US, just so you know, there's a big push right now. So in the states that have legalized assisted suicide, there's bills right now in California, Washington State, Hawaii, and Vermont to expand their assisted suicide laws. So what they're saying is, we've had this now for a few years. Now we're going to expand it, right? They're trying to get rid of their waiting periods. They're trying to allow more people to do it. So these laws now say a physician assistant can do it. So you don't have to just be a physician. Canada, as I say, it's nurse practitioners and doctors, and the US are talking physician assistants and nurses and doctors to be able to do these things, etc. So they're expanding who can do it. They're trying to get rid of the waiting periods. They're trying to look at the question of whether you have to be terminally ill or not. They're looking at the issue whether you have to do it yourself, because if you don't have to do it yourself, then suddenly what is it? It becomes euthanasia, it's homicide. In Washington State, the bill last year questioned whether or not you would have to actually do the act yourself, which would mean they would have legalized euthanasia if they accepted that. So you see where I'm coming. This is the constant expansion going on, and it's a natural expansion. You don't have to call it a slippery slope. If you're going to allow killing, we're only debating the rules now. That's all we're doing.
Yeah.
And those rules can change over time. And remember, we are human beings, and we all go through difficult times. So it's a normal thing to say, oh, well, if they can have that and this is legal, then why can't I have it? This is a sort of normal progression. And sadly, that's why you should be concerned, because that same progression will affect the US.
Can you talk about the fluctuation of the will to live? I was watching a video that an interview you had done recently, and I'm going to link to your YouTube page and the website to look at all the great interviews, but I caught that. Can you tell us about the researcher and some of those studies on the fluctuation of the will to live?
So the will to live issue is not just a Canadian issue, even though the researcher who actually really developed this whole will to live concept was Dr. Harvey Chachanoff, who is a psychiatrist here in Canada, who's in Winnipeg, and he's mainly been dealing with people who have cancer. That was his primary focus in developing his studies and etc. And what he proved is that the will to live fluctuates. So the concept of not having a waiting period in euthanasia becomes actually ridiculous if you think about his studies prove that almost everyone, nearly everyone, changes their mind over time depending on circumstances. So what he did is he was dealing in Winnipeg, as I say, with people who had cancer, and he would then go through a series of interviews with them. So every couple of days they'd be visited, they'd be talked to, they'd be asked questions, they'd be asked the same series of questions. So let's say Mr. So-and-so says on Wednesday that if euthanasia were legal, because at the time it wasn't legal when he was doing the study, if euthanasia were legal, he'd be interested. He'd be interested in a lethal injection. And so what? And you start asking questions. So he'd ask all these questions and find out, well, why are they interested now? And they'd find out, well, because that morning he was just told to get a worse prognosis. And so now he's like thinking about the fact that death is oncoming quicker. He's having some fears, some concerns, etc. But then he comes back on Friday and he interviews Mr. So-and-so again, and he's talking to him. And the guy says, of course I wouldn't want to die by euthanasia. I think about it, but no, I wouldn't want that. And then you start asking questions. Well, why don't you want that now? You said on Wednesday you did want it. And you go ask all these questions. And you find out, well, on Thursday, his grandchildren came to visit him.
Right.
Now he felt he had a reason to live. Mm-hmm. Everything changed for him now. Okay, no, I want to actually live now as long as I can, because I feel I have something that's still not finished yet in my life. I have purpose. I have meaning. And so Chachanoff was able to uncover the fact that as human beings, when you lack purpose and you lack meaning, that it's sort of normal at times that you might feel that you want your life to end. That's a normal human reality. Mm-hmm. Sadly, we need purpose. We need meaning. And so what he did is he developed a whole program around that. And so he trained a whole bunch of palliative care leaders in Canada in that whole program. So quite a few of our good palliative care centers use the Will to Live program, and they start asking questions, and they help somebody find meaning as they are dying. So then they grab onto every day as a new opportunity to experience something in their life as they are nearing their death. Mm-hmm. And he proved clearly that the will to live in humans clearly fluctuates, and it can fluctuate daily. So the concept of euthanasia then totally changes when you understand that in a human being, that in fact, when you're saying yes to euthanasia, now we've actually had the opposite effect happen now. So you have people who are contacting us, and they're all concerned because, let's say, the husband is dying of cancer, and he might have so many months to live or weeks to live or whatever, and he might ask about euthanasia. He's asked about May. Now, that doesn't mean he wants euthanasia, but he's asked about it. Okay? As soon as he asks about it, then the MAID team gets involved. And then they start going through the assessment. Immediately, they've gone through the assessment. And then they'll say to him, well, we've assessed you and we've approved you. And so we talk about, and then I get a call from the wife, and she's saying, what am I doing? What am I going to do? My husband's been approved for euthanasia. This is absolutely I'm absolutely abhorred by this. What are we going to do to stop this? And the problem is the law doesn't give his wife any rights whatsoever. None at all. And he might not have even sought euthanasia in the beginning. He might have been someone, this is the last thing he would have thought about. But now he's on what I call the maid train. They've scheduled it. They said, oh, this is a 10-day waiting period. So a week from Thursday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the maid team's going to come visit you. And if it's a Catholic hospital, let's say, so we are willing to visit you in your home. So we would have to then transfer you home on either the Tuesday or the Wednesday. They're immediately setting up the plans, right? Mm-hmm. And it started out with someone just inquiring. Now you'd say, well, the will to live fluctuates, Alex. I say, yes, but once you get onto the train, the maid train, it seems to get harder to get off when it's all planned. And that's another reality that's happening.
Matt, Alex talked about the meaning of life, or having a meaningful life, especially towards the end. Can you speak as a care partner, as a Catholic theology teacher, to even those who are not Catholic that are watching this? Can you talk about redemptive suffering and what kind of meaning? And after that, I'll ask for some final thoughts from both of you.
Yes, I believe that everybody has a purpose, and whether you have dementia or whether you're fit as a fiddle, it's up not just us to uncover that, but for especially others to help us live that out. And I'm very grateful that my Catholic faith has taught me that there is value in suffering. Unfortunately, our culture now says as soon as you get suffering, let's alleviate it. Right? Instead of embracing it and offering it up. And I think for people who are not religious or not Catholic, that's maybe will be their first time hearing that, I would just challenge them to walk with that we can embrace our suffering and use it for good, which is really novel. And I think that's in my own, you've asked the question, in my own circumstances, seeing Lisa's dementia progress, I've really come to see the gift that she not just gives to me every time I see her. I'll be leaving after this to go and see her, and she just has an uncanny ability to light up a room, to brighten my day. And I'll say that whether she knows I'm there or not, probably not, but I need to see her each and every day. And she has that ability. And in this whole issue we've been discussing here today, Matt, I just think how tragic that people would want to, say that her life is not of value and has no meaning because, JP2 talked about the utilitarian, right? The utilitarianism, that she's not productive anymore. Right. Well, but she gives me more than I could ever ask for. And so the whole embracing our suffering, walking with others in it, and uniting. And that's where you need a good support system, whether it be your faith community, your family, your friends, to journey through this, so.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, so any closing thoughts?
I was just going to say that we're working with an organization that was started called Compassionate Community Care. And the concept of compassionate community care is to train people to do visiting and to be with others, etc. Because it actually, as I'm sadly acknowledging, it's not something that's disappeared, but it's really dissipated in our culture, this whole concept of visiting and being with others. Now, right now we have a problem with COVID, which makes it worse. Nonetheless, we need each other. And so you need to recognize, is there things that we need to do or not do as we go visit someone? The other whole thing is helping someone find meaning. Meaning is so essential. And one of the ways we help people who, let's say, are alone and lonely find meaning is by talking to them about their own lives, being interested in who they are. Because, when you show interest in somebody, who they are, what they're about, you help them find meaning for themselves, because they then recognize you're actually interested in them as a human being, as a person. And so this is what it's involved in, training people to visit and then to communicate with them in a way that we help find meaning for them, help them find meaning through their own life, their own existence, etc. And I think this is a very effective thing to be doing. Sadly, as I say, it's something that's being lost in the culture. So how you regroup and refine that is by emphasizing the importance of it, and to help people be trained to have these skills that they might have normally just had 50 years ago, because they would have gone with their mother to do this 50 years ago, and now they can learn how to do it and to do this properly and effectively.
So how can we, Alex, how can we follow your organization to learn more? Of course, the website, the YouTube channel, which had some great interviews on there. Anything else that we should pay attention to follow you?
Well, you Google Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, we come up. We're not hard to find that way, actually. Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, but also, Alex Schedenberg, etc. I also have the world's #1 source of information on these issues with the blog I started so many years ago. It's got thousands and thousands of articles on all these issues, and it's been I've been running this blog since 2007. There's nothing else that exists like this in the world, and it's not about patting myself on the back. It's just about the fact that as long as you keep at it, you're building this massive inventory of information for people and history. But the fact is that they need to understand the issue. We understand the issue and we stand up. Silence doesn't help us. Okay, whether you're a person of faith or not a person of faith, whether you have very strong faith, we need to talk from our experience. We all have a lived experience, because that's how we communicate with other human beings. We share with them our experience, our life experience, and we all have empathy. So we're all capable to, some of us don't have the same empathy as others, but nonetheless, we all have a strong degree of empathy, and we can connect with each other. And that's what we need to be doing as much as possible. And now that it's been legalized in Canada, and assisted suicide is legal in California and Oregon, Washington State, et cetera, and all these places, we now have to become primarily concerned about each other. It's not enough to say, my neighbor or my friend or so-and-so is in church, and who's usually in church is now in the hospital. The question is, well, who's visiting them? Who's spending time with them? We forget that we're human. And by forgetting our humanity, we're not thinking that this person is going through a human crisis, and doing so alone is incredibly difficult. And so if you want to help that person to live until they die naturally, they need you. Okay? Sometimes they only need you to listen, but they need somebody to be there with them. As much as Matt says he doesn't know if his wife recognizes him or not, he, by being there with her, is providing an incredible emotional, because the emotions remain in that human body to the very end, connection. She's loved. That's important. That's fundamentally important. She's cared about. She's important. And this is what we need to be doing.
Excellent. Great way to end our conversation. Matt, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
On those words, no. Alex is bang on. Yep, I see that every time I visit Lisa. And not a lot of words are spoken, and that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Matt, Alex, thank you so much for being here. And also mostly for your vocation, for what you're doing. You're inspiring others. You're going to inspire the Peace with Dementia Rosary community in learning more about this before it even becomes a question in their minds. So thank you for being here. Continue your great work, and God bless.
God bless you.
Thank you very much, Matt.